Hello, valued viewers. I hope you're all doing very well. As you can see in the above graphic, I have recently turned on the Super Thanks button as part of my monetization of the channel itself. And folks, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I'm just going to say that after 33 years of working in one job one way or the other, due to a medical reason, I'm basically going to be forced to resign. So I'm only 53 years old, so I'm not much of a paper pusher. So I have no idea what I'm going to be doing in the future for employment. I'm not going to turn this into a boo-hoo fest. Basically, what I will tell you is it's not the dreaded C word, but it is serious enough to where I have to change professions. And I would like to thank you all for watching my videos. And with that, let's get on with the story. Okay, so the year is 1914, and that's when Russia entered World War I. And at the time, the country was mainly dependent on the 080 and 280 consolidation type locomotives. At that time, what the Russians really needed was a locomotive that had a higher adhesive weight and thus more tractive effort, of which could only be provided by a locomotive with 10 drive wheels. The Russians only had one 10 drive wheel locomotive, and that was the 010. And furthermore, they had problems with factory production because only one factory was producing locomotives in Russia. So in desperate need of these 10 drive wheel locomotives, Professor N.L. Shushkin, who was head of the Commission of Rolling Stock in Russia, proposed ordering up to 500 210 locomotives from the United States. Although the Americans were to be building these locomotives, the locomotive design itself was purely Russian. The design called for 10 drive wheels, a low axle loading, a larger firebox to burn low-grade coal, and an overall similar design to the Class 010s that Russia already had. Because of the weight of the boiler, particularly the firebox, this caused the axle load on some of the axles in this locomotive design to exceed 16 tons. It was decided at that point to add a lead pony or bogie, thus turning it into a 210 instead of an 010. This allowed a slightly bigger boiler while keeping the axle loadings within acceptable limits. Shushkin actually preferred to order a 210-2 locomotive because of its back guiding trucks, but the decision was to keep it as short as possible by utilizing the 210, which the shorter length would allow to fit it on smaller turntables. So then we reached 1915, and the Russians placed an order for the first 400 locomotives, and they entered production. In Russia, this class was given the name of Class E, with subclasses varying on the city of the manufacturer. E for Baldwin, EC for Alco, EK for Canadian Built, etc. It's worth noting that the locomotives were manufactured without brakes. This is due to the fact that it was determined to equip these locomotives with Westinghouse brakes, but this did not comply with the requirements of the Russian railways. Therefore, the braking equipment was commissioned by the Joint Stock Company of Westinghouse in Petrograd. For this reason, upon arriving in Vladivostok, which I know I pronounced that wrong, locomotives were first sent to the main workshops of the Chinese Eastern Railway in Harbin. There, the locomotives were equipped with brake apparatuses and prepared to be sent to the railways of the European part of Russia. So happy with the first order, in 1916, the Russians decided to order a further 475 locomotives with only minor changes, and this subclass was Class EN. These locomotives were slightly heavier with an adhesive weight of 80.3 tons. And once again, in 1917, Russia again decided to order more locomotives, and Baldwin was only able to supply 75 at the time. However, when the United States entered World War I, it decided to aid the Allied effort by producing more 210s for Russia. About 500 locomotives were ordered. However, production was interrupted by the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and thus the Russian government could not pay for these locomotives, and ultimately only 50 locomotives were delivered. This left some 200 or so locomotives stranded in the United States. At this point, the United States Railroad Administration decided to convert them to standard gauge by fitting wider tires and then distribute them among American railways. The Erie Railroad received 75, the Seaboard received 40, the St. Louis-San Francisco Railroad received 20, 17 directly from the U.S. government and 3 from other companies, and 22 other railways received lesser quantities. The unbuilt remainder of the order, 200 locomotives, was canceled. So that's the basics of the 210-0 decapod locomotive, which the design actually originated in Russia. In the United States, the 210-0 decapod was not very popular amongst all of the railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest orderer of the 210-0 decapod, and for the rest of this particular video, I will focus on the PRR's use of these locomotives. So 1916 was when the Pennsylvania Railroad started flirting with the 210-0 decapod, much to the chagrin of many Pennsylvania Railroad engineers. Those people had thought the locomotive was already obsolete by that time. And really to good reason, because first of all, the ride was very rough on everyone's track, including the Pennsylvania Railroads later, simply because the design didn't have a trailing truck. And also, the locomotive was very rough running on the tracks itself, and that caused problems for the crews and the locomotive itself at times. And lastly, the locomotive usually couldn't be run at higher speeds because of the vibrations and whatnot of the lack of the trailing truck once again. So in that 1916 years, the Pennsylvania Railroad committed to some 122 of these 210-0 decapod locomotives, where most of the rest of the railroads in the United States during that time were using the 210-2 arrangement. The Pennsylvania Railroad nicknamed these 210-0s the decks, and the use of them in 1916 was controversial among many Pennsylvania Railroad engineers. And so 1922 rolls around, and that's when the Pennsylvania Railroad placed even more orders. The Pennsylvania Railroad was soon the biggest user of the 210-0 decapod in the United States, and it's not even close. The type was ideally suited to the Pennsylvania's heavy graded Allegheny mountain routes, which required lugging ability according to tractive effort, not speed according to horsepower. So the Pennsy went on to buy 598 of the 210-0 decapods, or decks as they called them, with 123 of them built in his own Juanita shops, and the others were built from Baldwin. So the railroad classification for the Pennsylvania Railroad's 210-0 decapods was I-1, and unlike the Russian decapods, the Pensys were huge, taking advantage of the Pennsylvania Railroad's heavy trackage and high axle loading with a fat, free-steaming boiler that earned the type of nickname of hippos on the Pennsylvania Railroad. In addition, 2 giant cylinders measuring 30.5 inches by 32 inches gave the I-1s power, and their tenders permitted hard and long workings between stops. They were unpopular among the Pennsylvania Railroad crews, though, just like any other railroad, because they were hard riding. And the last operations of the 210-0 decapods, or decks, in the Pennsylvania Railroad was 1957. 13 total decapod locomotives survive in the United States today, including 2 Baldwin Standards, 6 of the Russian-designed decapods, and 1 of the Pennsylvania I-1s. 2 belong to the Great Western 90, a Baldwin decapod at the Strasburg Railroad, and the Frisco 1630, which was a Russian design, is at the Illinois Railway Museum, and those are operational. 1 decapod survives as a static exhibit at the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, North Carolina. So with that, the following specifications apply to the Pennsylvania Railroad's 210-0 decapod or hippo locomotive. The total weight of the locomotive was 590,800 pounds. The main driver's size was 62 inches. The height of the locomotive was 15 feet. The axle load was 72,600 pounds. The fuel capacity was 18.7 tons using coal. The water capacity of the tender was 10,300 US gallons. Fuel consumption was 7 tons of coal per hour. The firebox grate was 69.9 square feet. The boiler size was 93 inches. The boiler pressure was 250 psi. The cylinders were 2 high pressure at 30.5 inches by 32 inches. The valve gear used was Walschaerts. The maximum speed of the locomotive was 50 miles an hour. The maximum tractive effort achieved was 102,027 pounds. A total of 598 total 210 decapod or hippo locomotives were built, and as I mentioned, their retirement date was 1957. And with that, well, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content today, please hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't. And turn on all of your notifications if you want to see all of my updates, which are now daily. And also visit our print shop at Nickel Plate Limited at Etsy.com if you wish to directly support the shop in that way. Thank you once again.